our guest speakers. I'm really excited today to have Kasey Bliesner from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Lauren Osborne from the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation of Oregon, Ian Tattam, also from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Ken Fetcho from Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And together, they are going to give us an update on the Middle Fork John Day River Intensively Monitored Watershed, which I think, team, we've got a couple links to drop. This IMW has been around a long time. They've done a ton of stuff over the decades. They're just finished their 15-year summary report, which will be the focus of the presentation today. But I'll encourage you on your own time later to take a look at their website, which has a ton of information. Also, thank you for the nod to PNAMP and the PNAMP IMW network, which we strive to facilitate. Another thing I want to point out is within that website, there is a page specifically about publications and reports. And like I said, there's many peer-reviewed papers, a bunch of good reports, and several master's and PhD theses, all of which have come out of this really special project. So with that, I welcome our 4 guests, and I'm let you guys take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Meg. I'm going to start off our presentation today. My name is Kasey Bliesner. I'm a project analyst and the co-coordinator of the Middle Fork John Day IMW. We'll also have Lauren Osborne with the Warm Springs. She is a fish biologist and monitoring coordinator. Ian Tattam, who is our ODFW acting program manager for the East Region Fish Research Office, and Ken Fetcho, who is the OWEB Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator, Tribal Liaison, and my co-coordinator with the Middle Fork John Day IMW. And we're going to walk through our 2024 summary report, which was put together with 15 contributing authors, and we've had hundreds of participants over the years with the Middle Fork John Day IMW. Next slide. Here's a brief presentation outline. I'm going to be presenting the first 3 or 4 bullets. Lauren will come in and talk about monitoring projects overview, and then Ian will step in at the end and go through key findings, adaptive management, recommendations, and next steps. Ken is here to answer questions at the end and to provide support, and he also was instrumental in putting this presentation together. So the Middle Fork, oh, sorry, next slide. I keep forgetting that I'm not advancing slides. The Middle Fork John Day IMW was established in 2008 by the Upper Middle Fork Working Group. Like I said before, there's been many, many, many agencies and hundreds of participants over the last 15 years. IMWs are long-term project designed to deepen our understanding of how fish populations respond to habitat restoration. And our focal species for the Middle Fork are spring chinook and threatened summer steelhead. We receive core funding through PSMFC, which is and the funding is administered through OWEB. And as Jen mentioned, we are part of the Pacific Northwest IMW network, of which PNAMP hosts and facilitates many of those activities. The primary objective of the Middle Fork IMW is to evaluate the overall benefit of restoration actions to summer steelhead and spring chinook salmon populations in the Upper Middle Fork, and more specifically, to understand how specific restoration actions impact in-stream habitat, water temperature, and salmonid metrics at the watershed, sub-watershed, and reach scales. And as with other IMWs, our objectives also include some of these objectives mentioned in the Bennett et al. 2016 paper, which are to document and share these lessons learned from the network of IMWs so that resource managers in the Pacific Northwest can implement further restoration with greater confidence, and effectiveness monitoring efforts can be prioritized and directed for maximum benefit within our own IMW and across the Pacific Northwest. Next slide. And so, Meg, I've got like 3 arrows. If you can just kind of advance like 3 more times, I think they'll pop up. So numerous limiting factors have been identified through various monitoring modeling efforts in the Middle Fork, and summer water temperature and water quantity are the primary limiting factors. We've listed these limiting factors in a sort of qualitative hierarchy, which is demonstrated by that down arrow, to highlight that changing habitat diversity will have limited effectiveness if stream temperature remains too high, and to guide actions into addressing temperature, the most important limiting factor first, and then address others once temperature is controlled. We recognize, though, that the system is much different state than historic, and massive structural changes of treatments to restore ecological processes may be needed in some reaches to effectively deal with temperature. And thus, those curved arrows sort of back up the line indicate that interplay between the different factors. The pictures represent some of the degraded and altered systems that are being dealt with in the Middle Fork, including dredge mining, railroad grades, disconnected tributaries, incised channels, trampled and grazed and browsed vegetation, and even the need to remove some historic restoration actions like those log weirs in Camp Creek that proved to be detrimental to habitat rather than beneficial. Next slide. So, you know, in the spirit and as part of our objectives in sharing these findings and our results, the Middle Fork Working Group dedicated 2023 to writing a summary report, which we're calling the 2024 summary report. We built off a 10-year summary report completed in 2017 that summarized monitoring that has continued, or this recent report will summarize monitoring that has continued since the 10-year report, such as fish in, fish out, and benthic and drift macroinvertebrate data, and new monitoring efforts that were initiated after 2018. Starting in early 23, we formed a core team, most of us are presenting today, which worked on structure, background, and coordination. And then through the IMW Working Group monthly meetings and email distribution lists, we asked for volunteers to author individual chapters based on the recent research. And so these research chapters were compiled along with background information into the current 2024 summary report. We also compiled and are providing a restoration inventory, which I'll talk about later, so that contributing authors could include that into their analyses. We updated the overall IMW timeline to record and celebrate key milestones that have occurred since 2008. And we performed an assessment of adaptive management to record implementation of lessons learned and recommendations that came from the 10-year summary report. And we asked for a new list of lessons learned and recommendations so we can keep that, you know, that learning moving forward and the adaptive management process going. Finally, authors submitted their chapters, and we recruited at least 2 reviewers per chapter to go through the reports and provide comments to incorporate that element of peer review, which was important to us. So we're in the final stages of this report, and we're, you know, right now we're adding lessons learned and new recommendations based on feedback from the larger IMW working group and the larger IMW network. And when we're completed with this report, it will be shared on the IMW website and PNAMP website. And, you know, we've got lots of ways that we're rolling out these results with various audiences, including this presentation today. Next slide. So as part of the IMW, we have been keeping record of restoration actions since 2008 in a restoration inventory. And so this map shows points of restoration activities implemented since 2008, which includes a minimum of 149 projects. Not every project was recorded. Each shape and color represent the primary restoration action implemented at that location, although most projects contain multiple actions to address multiple limiting factors. And as restoration practitioners have learned and adapted over the last 15 years, actions have shifted. So in the more recent 5 years, the 2017 to 2022 time period, restoration projects focused more on in-stream habitat improvements, such as large wood placement and floodplain reconnection, and riparian fencing and planting. And a majority of the work has been focused in very specific areas with, you know, very active landowner interest and focus. And so you can see these orange arrows that depict these locations. And 3 of these, the Dunstan, Oxbow, and Forest Conservation Areas, are Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs owned, and the Camp Creek is U.S. Forest Service. And so you can see sort of the large, sort of spread of restoration projects. But when you look at it in the bigger context, restoration has really only been applied to about 17% of the stream miles of steelhead distribution and 7% of all stream miles. So there's a lot of work left to do. And this is a big watershed, and we may need to do more wide-scale intensive restoration to see a detectable fish response, which is part of our IMW objective. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, there are a few key areas of intensive restoration where the Confederate Tribes of the Warm Spring and the Forest Service are landowners. And at these locations, they are addressing multiple limiting factors through implementation of multifaceted stream restoration projects. The Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs owns and manages these 3 distinct conservation areas representing thousands of acres and miles of main stem that provide ample opportunity to design and implement restoration actions and to conduct research. These former cattle ranches were acquired with federal and state funding and have been key to providing restoration and research opportunities. And so partners have built off what they've learned in implementing this, in particular, the 5-phase Oxbow Conservation Area, in which dredge tailings reaches, or learning and implementing in this 5-phase Oxbow Conservation Area, and are applying those lessons learned to take a more valley-wide approach to restoring processes in the Forest Conservation Area. And the U.S. Forest Service has developed a long-term restoration plan in the Camp Creek watershed, which is a major tributary to the Middle Fork. And with input from partners, they have worked over the last 20 years to implement restoration across this important tributary with multiple phases, including a valley-wide approach and intensive planting and fencing, and with lots of partnership with the North Fork John Day Watershed Council. So now that I've provided this background and restoration summaries, I'm going to pass the baton over to Lauren, who will walk through the author research chapters, which highlight research and investigations and how fish habitat and macros are responding to restoration.
Thanks, Kasey. As Kasey mentioned, I will be covering what you can expect to find within the individual reports provided for the larger 2024 summary report. Next slide, please. So to start us off, Kasey, Ian, and Nadine's analysis of watershed scale Chinook salmon and steelhead abundance and productivity provides estimates of spawner escapement of steelhead and Chinook salmon populations to the Middle Fork John Day River and estimates of freshwater productivity of Chinook salmon and steelhead populations. They then compare the Middle Fork John Day River Chinook salmon and steelhead abundance and productivity indicators for years before and after implementation to reference areas within the John Day River Basin. Next slide. Lindsay's report looks at quantifying riverscape productivity to inform limiting factor analysis and guide reach-based restoration goals. The objectives here were to quantify spatial variation in juvenile salmonid productivity measured through abundance, growth, and survival across mainstem salmonid rearing habitats, and to evaluate the relationship between juvenile salmonid productivity metrics and habitat variables. Next slide. Melody's assessment of patterns of spring Chinook salmon fry emergence and dispersal across the Middle Fork John Day River Basin was aimed at describing an emergence time window for fry and determine if emergence timing has shifted since it was last studied over 40 years ago. It also characterizes Chinook salmon fry dispersal from red locations and habitat utilization by flow patterns. Next slide. Matt, Lindsay, Melody, and Joe's report looks at juvenile Chinook salmon dispersal patterns across the Middle Fork John Day River. So here we're looking at small dispersal patterns as opposed to fry in the previous report. The objectives were to estimate juvenile abundance, relate dispersal spatial patterns to juvenile distribution, evaluate population level dispersal patterns, assess dispersal pattern variation as a function of red location, and evaluate potential mechanisms driving dispersal patterns. Next slide, please. Pat, Lisa, and Matthew's work summarizes the long-term effects of passive and active restoration in the Middle Fork John Day River, which quantifies changes in physical, aquatic, and riparian habitat since the 1990s. They determined whether there were differences in the trajectories of 5 different management and restoration approaches, which range from passive restoration, including the installment of fencing around riparian areas, to active earth-moving restoration, such as the remeandering of stream channels. They also determine which of the 5 approaches was most effective in improving habitat. Next slide, please. Myself and Matt compiled a report including planting efficacy and groundwater monitoring on the Middle Fork Oxbow Conservation Area. The planting efficacy piece compared efficacy work completed and plant survival between and across years, with the 2021 efficacy work initially having more specific objectives that are listed here. However, we had really high rates of browse in our area. Therefore, because of low survival, the analyses were limited to general survival assessments. The groundwater monitoring component concentrated on detecting changes in groundwater elevations before and after restoration implementation, as well as comparing groundwater elevations generally across space and time. Next slide. Z and Michael provided a macroinvertebrate community analysis as contractors for the North Fork John Day Watershed Council, as requested by Javen Bailey. The objectives of the drift sampling analyses were to understand how shifts in community structure and biomass vary across space, and to understand what the shift in community structure looks like at each site. So here we're looking at shifts in functional feeding groups, sensitive taxa, or maybe something different going on in these locations for drift sampling. And then the objectives of the benthic sampling were to understand what mechanisms are driving the stability or shift of macro communities through time or space. And then also looking at what the shifts look like at each site and how do shifts compare among sites within differing levels of habitat improvements, ranging from no restoration to simply passive restoration processes to combinations of passive and active restoration practices. Next slide. And then lastly, Stefan's assessment of water temperature trends investigates temperature trends at 86 temperature monitoring locations within the Middle Fork John Day River to determine if and where significant trends are occurring and how significant trends relate in proximity to restoration areas. So hopefully with this overview, it sparks some specific questions on individual reports, and we'll encourage you to dive further into their contents once the 2024 summary report is distributed. And if you have any report specific questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out and we can get you connected with the specific authors if we're not able to answer the questions during the Q&A. And with that, I'll pass it off to Ian to finish out the remainder of the talk, which will put the 2024 summary report findings into a broader, more applicable context.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Let's go ahead and jump into the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap up some of the high-level review of some of these key metrics and then place it into an overall context and then also talk about the next steps and directions we're heading. So to jump into water temperature first, we wanted to note that, water temperatures have largely remained stable despite this study occurring during a period of increasing average air temperature and decreasing annual mean stream flow. And nested within that result, about 10% of the sites monitored have demonstrated a decreasing trend in water temperature, with about half of those sites being located in restoration reaches. So within the, I'm seeing chat.
Hey, Ian.
People having trouble hearing me?
Yeah, there's some feedback that's kind of distracting. I don't know if something's going on with your microphone.
Yeah, I don't know. It sounded like it was good earlier, but let's try.
Yeah,
It
sounded fine earlier.
Is that any better for people? Or the same?
Yeah, a little bit better, Ian. It's just got a weird tinging like at the end of it.
Weird. How about that?
Yeah, that might be better.
Okay. Well, yeah, apologies, but I guess, yeah, if it really sounds really bad, just someone throw a virtual tomato at me, but otherwise we'll just keep going. Okay, so jumping in back in the third bullet here, related to water temperature monitoring, we also did focused part of smolt survival monitoring to identify where across the riverscape the high summer temperatures had the greatest negative impact to juvenile Chinook salmon survival. And, you know, related to that monitoring, some of the genetic mark recapture monitoring also found that Chinook parr originating in sections with high water temperatures were more prone to disperse to either cooler main stem or tributary habitats, especially during the heat dome year in 2021. So next slide, please. Okay, so jumping into the mechanistic understanding of restoration actions, and this is a really key part of IMWs, right? The goal of these is to some extent to identify the mechanisms relating actions to results so that those can be applied to other watersheds, since we can't apply this level of monitoring activity across the network of the whole Pacific Northwest. So some key findings we found in this summary report were positive habitat responses were greater in reaches with both passive and active restoration approaches. And related to that, a combination of active and passive restoration, along with shifts in riparian vegetation composition, all contributed to enhanced habitat complexity. And a big key there was the expansion of torrent sedges across the riverscape, and that improved the habitat complexity in the Middle Fork John Day. So thirdly, the intensive installment of riparian plantings did not necessarily guarantee revegetation success. So Lauren hinted at that a little bit earlier. There's a lot of browsers and other things going on across the landscape that, you know, negatively affect riparian planting. So it's not enough to just plant them, call it good, and walk away. They need an extensive thought, you know, extensive consideration of plantings before and after the actual act of the planting. And then finally, the restoration practices aimed at raising groundwater elevation, you know, had some mixed results across the large-scale floodplain restoration projects. And so, you know, intensive monitoring of those, I think, is key through the future. So let's go on to the next slide. So jumping into the macro invertebrate community, results suggested really no consistent relationship between restoration intensity and macro community response. The benthic macro results did suggest that the Middle Fork John Day has a more diverse assemblage compared to the South Fork of the John Day, which is one of the control watersheds for the Middle Fork IMW. And both the benthic and drift results indicated some positive, you know, post-restoration changes in ecological conditions at sites where both active and passive restoration occurred. And I think, you know, in sum, these drift results are really a pretty good kind of thread of positive response of the riverscape conditions to for juvenile salmonas because of increasing number of mayflies, increased drift concentration, and kind of a broad scale improvement in food availability. Next slide. Watershed scale fish response. I'll go through steelhead on the left panel first and then Chinook on the right. For steelhead, you know, we have not observed increases in freshwater productivity for steelhead in the Middle Fork in the Middle Fork John Day since 2008. But it's also important to note here that productivity hasn't decreased over the past 5 years during a period of fairly intensive drought conditions in general. In contrast, the South Fork John Day reference steelhead population has shown some indication of declining freshwater productivity as a result of those drought years during the last 5 of the IMW monitoring. And overall, to link back to the hierarchical flow of limiting factors that Kasey discussed at the beginning, steelhead recovery in the Middle Fork is still largely hindered by density dependence of juvenile life stage, which is driven primarily by temperature limited rearing habitat. And so changes in those other potential limiting factors aren't going to be manifested in a productivity response until the temperature and flow components are addressed. So jumping to Chinook salmon, again, abundance and productivity have not significantly changed since the inception of the Middle Fork IMW. We have noted a pretty dramatic shift in the spawning distribution of adults. As some of the restoration projects have come online, the distribution of adult Chinook reds has changed from the upstream areas to some of the more downstream areas like the Oxbow Conservation Area. Next slide. So to put these conclusions in context, I think overall fish temperature has not changed, has been maintained through the period of this IMW, and not surprisingly, fish productivity has also been maintained but not increased. But I think some historical context is also important. So I put 2 quotes in here from the 1986 completion report of the first round of ODFW's monitoring of spring Chinook salmon in the John Day. And that went from about 1975 to 1984 and was written up in 1986. And so I won't read those quotes, but in a nutshell, I feel like the data indicate that we're in a much better position for Chinook salmon productivity now than we were in the 80s. Certainly, we're not ready to fly the mission accomplished banner and land on the aircraft carrier yet, but productivity has been maintained despite a period of increasingly worse global environmental conditions and ocean conditions. So, I think that's a positive takeaway from all the effort that many folks have put into this IMW. But that said, I think one key conclusion is that we still need to remember to focus on restoration actions in a reach scale context. So let's jump to the next slide. And this is one of our takeaways from the 10-year report in terms of adaptive management, was that on this leftmost vertical kind of bar here, we found it's really hard to identify and detect changes in fish population response at the watershed scale in a relatively short time frame. And so after the 10-year report, we committed to focusing more effort on reach scale and shorter term metric monitoring. And so that's some of the things we're bringing forward in this 2024 summary report, are greater focus on short-term metrics like macroinvertebrates, temperature, fry dispersal patterns, and changes in juvenile salmonid productivity and distribution across the riverscape. And let's jump to the next slide. And this is one of our initial products, I think, out of that shift to focusing on juvenile restoration, juvenile monitoring, and how we can apply this or translate this into restoration recommendations. So this is the Middle Fork John Day flowing from the bottom right of your screen to the upper left. And on the upper left, you can see the downstream reaches are shaded in red. And so those are areas that are currently temperature limited for juvenile Chinook rearing. And so in those areas, really the focus needs to be on temperature management and reducing summer stream temperatures. And it doesn't make sense to work on in-channel or diversity metrics there until the temperature piece is addressed. Whereas in the middle section in the yellow, that's an area where, in part because of the cold water influence from Granite Boulder Creek, temperature constraints are met. And so temperature is not the limiting factor, density, dependence, and habitat diversity and quality is. So focusing on those habitat metrics there makes sense. Whereas in the orange and other upstream red areas, there's a combination of both temperature limitation and temperature and density limitations. So this is an example of how we've worked to bring the restoration recommendations down to a reach scale for Chinook. And we're hoping to expand this out to steelhead as well across the broader network universe of steelhead in the future. Next slide. And so with that, jumping into some next steps, I think we really want to continue to emphasize that actions have to address the REACH-specific limiting factors, and also realize that multiple work iterations will likely be necessary. We can't go in and change a highly modified landscape back to some sort of a quasi-historical situation in one work application. It's probably going to take multiple projects within one REACH to gradually work towards that REACH-specific limiting factor. And we've got a few pictures on the screen here of Phipps Meadow, which is the very headwaters of the Middle Fork John Day. And through land acquisition, now this is an opportunity to really do a large-scale restoration project in the headwater of the Middle Fork John Day, which can then help set the stage for recovery throughout the watershed. And as we think about Phipps Meadow and other projects, we also need to realize that, you know, larger channel reset actions may be needed to help recreate some of the historical processes that are now missing in the riverscape. And those projects could help us offset increasing air temperatures through time. Next slide. So with that, we're going to jump into questions. I think all three of us plus Ken are happy to tackle any questions that folks have in however much time we have left. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. A lot of stuff. Let's carve out a few minutes for questions. And we're already kind of at our time, but anyone want to drop a question in the chat? Did I already miss one? Nope. Raise your hand, just turn on your mic. Come on, it's got to be a question.
Hey, Jody, go ahead.
Thanks. Go ahead and turn on my camera to a little social here. It's not a question, actually. I just wanted to genuinely thank you guys. This was incredibly informative. I really appreciated the overview and the clear intentional effort to show how you applied the information in an adaptive management approach. We've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the years, developing strategies, figuring out what to fund where, working with partners. And I found the presentation extremely useful and just wanted to let you know how it was received, even though I don't have a specific question at this time. I did take a lot of screenshots. I don't know if you're going to share the presentation, but I thought it was excellent. And so thank you very much. I can see you guys put a lot of time and effort into the presentation. Over.
Thanks, Jody. And I mean, so much in there. You must have really put a lot of time in to be able to convey all of that so succinctly in half an hour. So, and we
100%.
would love to share this presentation, the slides and the recording if the speakers are willing. And I think, Meg, I'm not sure if you had a chance to ask that question. So that's partly why we recorded it. We're also going to record the rest of the meeting, but that really, we're not going to publish that. But if the four of you speakers are okay with it, we would love to put this out on the PNAMP YouTube channel. Rachel, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. I was curious where you store like the data as far as the temperature data that you're gathering. I'm really appreciate the number of sites. I think it was what, 84 or something. I was just curious where that information is shared.
Yeah, so we store, oh, Kasey, you can.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
I was
Lauren.
just going to say our temperature storing is a part of a larger partnership effort. And so the North Fork John Day Watershed Council houses what's called the whiskey database that contains all of the temperature for the Middle Fork of the John Day River. So it includes the 86 sites that are talked about here and potentially some extras.
Okay. Yeah, if you could share the link, I'd love to be able to just have access to the temperature data.
Oh, so I think it's by request.
Oh, okay.
So I can drop my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out, and I can put you in contact with the people who organized that.
Cool. Thank you so much.
And we will put all 4 of our presenters, even the silent presenter, Ken, we'll put your contact in the notes so people can reach out with you. Do you have a question, Ken, before we jump to round robin? I think you're muted.
Yeah.
At least it doesn't show you as muted, but I can't hear you, Ken.
Oops. Can you guys hear me now?
There we go. Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
That was on mute. So we talk a lot about data accessibility here at PNAMP, right? And so, but there's multiple tools and steps to making that happen, as we all know. And so the Whiskey database is just proprietary software that is time series software that the partnership can manage the water temperature data. And then OWEB asks that the water temperature monitoring that we fund through the NOAA funding, that they submit that to Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And so there's a large subset of those sites that are then submitted to DEQ, and that data is managed and then ultimately shared through the Water Quality Exchange Network. So that is available through that. But as Lauren said, depending on your interests, we can provide responses to data requests. So thank you.
Thanks, Ken. All right. Well, with that, I think we should move on, but I want to thank our guests today. You're welcome to stick around if you want to learn more about what PNAMP's up to. You're very welcome to stay. We'll understand if you slip away, and we're very grateful for your time today and to get ready for this excellent presentation. Thank you so much.